Hello! Today I'm taking a look at Final Fantasy VI, which was a milestone for JRPG gaming in terms of narrative design and depth of story, and was arguably a point of transition and maturity for the Final Fantasy series. Now, a Final Fantasy VI retrospective does already exist on the channel, and I'll link to that below. And this isn't necessarily designed to supersede that. However, much like the other more modern and contemporary Final Fantasy games, there's always more to discuss and more to discover around it. And since I've recently inched into 6k subscribers, I thought I'd celebrate with Final Fantasy VI, but also take this opportunity to delve a little more into the structure and the narrative innovations of this title that made it so successful and persist as one of the best told stories in the Final Fantasy series, that paved the way for future JRPGs, including its successor, Final Fantasy VII. So, jumping right in, I'd like to focus on Final Fantasy VI foremost as a mature and emotive journey, and I think beyond the fervent shift from wisty high fantasy into sci-fi dystopian settings, for which it is often remarked, it is distinguished from its predecessors, and indeed to this day, for how it crafted and told a story, and indeed went so far as to craft the mechanics and each facet of the game experience around delivering on a story rather than anything else. Everything is done in service of the story and to elevate the themes and emotional arcs of a character-driven ensemble, rather than provide, for example, a complex and strategic grind of battles. Indeed, it's interesting to compare Final Fantasy VI with its predecessor, Final Fantasy V, because we can really observe how polarised it is with anything that had come before. And while by no means a bad game, Final Fantasy V is certainly renowned for playing it safe, having a conventional, if lacklustre story, propped up by quite an interesting job class system. While Final Fantasy VI, on the other hand, is so focused on delivering its experiential, character-driven story, it pared down a lot of the traditional RPG conventions, such as classes, in service of democratising use of each of its characters, and player agency to determine which of those characters they want to play as. And it's been termed in the past as an example of bringing the character and not the class, which is to say, rather than determining job classes and roles for a fixed set of party members, or having to bring along a mage because you need strong magic, at several intervals of Final Fantasy VI you can choose the party members you want based on preference and narrative intrigue. And to facilitate that, a lot of the abilities, such as summons, magic, and special attacks, can overlap, or at least equalise across the party as you level and progress. So rather than being hamstrung and beholden to fixed class mechanics, a player can generally bring a party member that they prefer story-wise. So this is just some evidence of story and characters being prioritised over more conventional RPG elements. And looking at the games that succeeded Final Fantasy VI, such as Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, which had the cross-party materia and junctioning systems, and Final Fantasy X, which, aside from summoning, which was exclusive to Yuna, the party had the party-wide sphere grid, so they could overlap on attributes and abilities there. And I think we could reasonably attribute some of the success and some of the hallmarks of these games to the mechanical foundations that were laid out in Final Fantasy VI. Now, taking a step beyond class mechanics and looking at how this story-focused approach took shape is another oft-noted aspect of Final Fantasy VI, which was the sheer size of its playable cast. And including unlockable characters, this racks up at around 14 characters in our party, which off the top of my head, I think it remains the largest playable cast for a mainline, or indeed any Final Fantasy game, aside from perhaps Final Fantasy Tactics. And once again, it shows the attentiveness to building up themes and story through characterizations and personalities, rather than an onerous grind of strategic battles and dungeon crawls that many JRPGs up to this point proved to be. Now, while it is undoubtedly an ensemble title, clearly some characters more than others have detailed arcs, contribute to the story, and received their share of development. And that makes sense because even within the realm of the RPG, where games can happily span 80, 100 plus hours, you don't need or necessarily want to tell 14 backstories or develop arcs for each and every playable character. But what is done very well in the game, and we see this in other fantasy media, is that supporting cast come along to help and augment certain elements of the world or story. So although they may not feature prominently or have their own prominent agendas, they offer something to our impression of the world, the events, the protagonists or the antagonists. And just looking to other media, whether it's Lord of the Rings or the Marvel movie franchise, you have your protagonists, such as Frodo Baggins or the Avengers, and then you have your supporting characters, such as Merry and Pippin, or War Machine and Agent Coulson, who contribute to the story, and they're very far from irrelevant characters, but nor do they necessarily warrant a dedicated or extended arc within these particular adventures. So, turning to Final Fantasy VI, we can see an equal split throughout the ensemble, where most of our prominent characters, such as Locke, Terra, Celes, Edgar and Sabin, for example, have issues to contend with and reconcile with the past, whether it's Terra's memory, Locke's dead lover, or the inheritance of Figaro for the two brothers. And after these, we have secondary characters, such as Cyan, Strago, Shadow, Setzer, and so on, who equally have their past dilemmas and backstories. And then we have the tertiary or supporting cast, such as Gore, Mog, and Gogo. And these characters support the party, provide a little more diversity to the gameplay, but also help service the characterization of the world and of the primary cast. And for example, Sabin and Cyan recruiting Gore, reintroducing him to his father, is a prime example that helps develop our ideas of these characters. But the distinguishing feature, or the undistinguishing feature of the supporting cast, is that they don't have too much involvement with the key events of the main game. So where the primary and secondary characters, whether it's Terra or Locke, and their issues, rooting back to the Castalian Empire being at fault, the supporting cast arguably don't have that much involvement with the core political, world-endangering events. Now, the reason this works so well is how the story structured the introduction of the characters and unified them to a single cause. Each of them had their own room to be developed, starting with Terra and Locke in the introduction at Nash, followed by Edgar and Sabin, and so on. And by splitting up the party at specific points, such as Bannon, Sabin and Terra fleeing down the Leith River, we're able to spend time in these small pockets of character scenarios without having the full party at our disposal, which dilutes and muddles the potential for development and personal arcs to take place. And it's interesting because if we look at the broad scope of the game, we spend all this time building up these characters, bringing this motley collective together in their unified cause against the Empire. And then once Kefka destroys everything and the world of Ruin hits, this newly banded fellowship is dispersed across the world, and we're forced to reunite them. But this is brilliant because by this time, such is the calibre of the storytelling and the empathy elicited for our characters to the player, we are really driven to sort of pull through and try and band them back together, so it becomes quite an emotive tale towards the end game, which I'll touch on later. So, in keeping with the structure of the game, one thing that set Final Fantasy VI apart, which I mentioned in my earlier retrospective, was the relentless pace at which the story worked. And from the outset of Terra's arrival in Nash, the dogged pursuit of our heroes by the Empire persists pretty much throughout the entirety of the story. And indeed, where many Final Fantasy games start off by throwing you into the action, whether it's Avalanche bombing Sector 7 or Tantalus kidnapping Princess Garnet, few games in the series have maintained such a bleak and perpetual harrying of the central characters. And indeed, where other titles usually see the heroes pursuing a villain, such as following Sephiroth's Man in the Black Cape in Final Fantasy VII, or embarking on the Dole mission and later the assassination mission to fend off Galbadia and the Sorceress in Final Fantasy VIII. In Final Fantasy VI, it is the villain pursuing the heroes. And so, firstly, the breezy respites we see in other games are stripped away in favour of this perpetual drama and pursuit. And secondly, to make this work well, the villain is elevated to become a much more prominent feature of the game. And Kefka is among the first well-characterised and persistently present and dialoguing bad guys of the series, which again I've touched on in my Final Fantasy VI retrospective and my top 5 Final Fantasy villains episode. But it can't be understated how significant Kefka is to the series, because prior to this, with the exception perhaps of Golbez in Final Fantasy IV, who was the first real attempt to characterise a bad guy, but he still didn't feature much or appear much in the game. Kefka, however, appears on stage and on screen, at regular intervals. He creates the conditions by which our party bands together and unifies, with a prime example being the poisoning of the kingdom of Doma, which brings Cyan into the fold. And so he really flipped the script for a Final Fantasy title, because looked at a certain way, we are following Kefka's story rather than our heroes, who are simply responding to him. They are victims of everything that he's doing, his aims and his intentions, which he consistently relays to us in his monologues when he appears on screen. So it's very interesting that we are following Kefka's actions up to and including him destroying the world, and how our party of heroes are simply reacting to that. So yeah, very interesting element of the game, I think, and as I say, Kefka has been discussed in the past on the channel. Now, going back to Kefka's impact on the heroes, this ongoing pursuit is integral to the story, I think, because beyond the themes of duality, which I've discussed in the past, I think another theme that's prevalent in the game is survival, but survival in its most brutal and desperate sense, wherein almost every scenario in Final Fantasy VI sees our heroes having to escape, regroup, and try and live to fight another day. And this is where the JRPG power of friendship trope comes into play, which, while it is a stereotype of the genre, and particularly Final Fantasy, I think it was employed extremely well and very potently here, because the fellowship is the unifying factor between our characters, and the mutual reassurance and camaraderie creates this glimmer of hope that salvages them from despair, particularly in the world of Ruin, because it's here, dramatically, that it transpires that they haven't saved the world, they haven't stopped Kefka, and thus the only incentive to keep going and carry on is this base survival instinct that's bolstered and supported by their friends, and that sliver of hope that each of them share. And that's why I think it's quite a conscious narrative decision to break up the party in the world of Ruin and require the player to try and reunite them, because it's that fellowship, it's that mutual reliance, and the hope elicited from that is so central to the emotional and thematic core of Final Fantasy VI. And when we talk about Final Fantasy VI being a mature story, I think this is the crux of it, because no longer do we have this light-hearted, wistful high fantasy where we need to retrieve an item for a king and defeat an arbitrarily evil wizard, or whatever the case may be. And instead what we have is a bleak and unrelenting reality that takes its toll on our heroes as time wears on. There's something quite relatable about that. You know, we have emotions of rage and regret and despair and hopelessness among our heroes, not to mention an unprecedented number of character deaths and NPC deaths that occur throughout the game. And so it's only this companionship of others. As we've said, you know, we have Locke and General Leo who help Terra. We have Cyan and Sabin fostering this kinship together. And equally we have Edgar and Sabin settling their past differences. So it's this that holds Final Fantasy VI together and makes it quite a human and emotional story. So in all, despite the death and destruction, Final Fantasy VI is strangely redemptive and consoling because of its little victories, if we can call them that. Our heroes don't save the world, but they do find solace and reason to continue in one another. It's a testament to overcoming adversities and personal demons, and while it does subscribe to the well-trodden path of the Fellowship quest and the power of friendship, it's the way it frames the Fellowship against such desperate odds that really makes it an emotional and rewarding experience, when we as players are able to facilitate and witness them pull through together, if only as survivors, if nothing else. So there we have it. That about wraps up my brief look at the brilliance of the narrative structure of Final Fantasy VI, and how everything from the pace to the game mechanics are constructed in service of the story. It was a dramatic break from Final Fantasy V and the games that had come before, and it undoubtedly laid foundations for the next generation of Final Fantasy. And indeed, with all this talk of remasters and remakes at the moment, it comes as little surprise that so many fans of the games would like to see Final Fantasy VI given current generation treatment, and ushered out of its deceptively archaic top-down pixel graphics into something more advanced that reflects the maturity of its calibre of story. So, as I'm playing back through Final Fantasy VI at the moment, I may return with further discussions of characters, game elements, story elements, and so on. But if you're interested to hear my extended thoughts on the game, I'll drop some links in the description of related episodes. Finally, if you got this far, kudos to you and thanks for listening. And please consider liking, sharing and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, which will keep you up to date with my latest episodes.